we are so excited to talk about Scrappy Quilts today.
This is something that you've all asked a lot about over the years, and it's something that we really enjoy doing.
Well, it's not also about rules so much as it is some strategies to help you tame the palette a little bit, because it can be challenging to have 100 fabrics and make them look cohesive.
Yeah, the concept of scrappy can be intimidating because it kind of implies an anything goes, but that doesn't usually really work. You need some constraints.
Yeah, and we've learned this the hard way. So feel free to add your questions in the comment section. I got some off of social media yesterday, so we'll be answering those as well. Somebody commented that they appreciate that there's no filling. Hold on, you've got just a little bit of, he's got a
touching on each
other. They appreciate that there isn't fill.
Sorry, we're not talking about what we had for dinner last night. We just want to talk about
Although we could. I'm kind of interested in what people served, what their Halloween candy of choice was. But anyway.
But we're going to get to...
First order of business is the November palette of the month. And we didn't coordinate our...
I didn't even think of that. So it's funny, just right before we were about to go live, we said, you're wearing green too.
Okay, so coincidentally, Grove is our November palette of the month. And this, we are so much influenced by our environment, and we spend a lot of time walking through woods and very forest different preserves near us, even though we live, near a third largest metropolitan city in the country.
But if you've never been to Chicago, there's a forest preserve that kind of parallels the shoreline that goes for...
Well, there's numerous
it's almost continuous, though, for, 40 miles or something.
But we also walk a lot in Michigan, too.
So anyway.
PJ Reed says Scrappy is her favorite color. Love it! I love it. Scrappy is my favorite color. Can we borrow that phrase? That is great.
So anyway, the Grove palette of the month is November and is just live on the website.
Yes. And all of these are while supplies last.
Yes.
We're just going to be we have some other things planned for 2023. So the solid bundles, we will keep producing the same bundles next year.
But we're not going to introduce a new one each month next year. This is a 2022 thing.
Yes.
But we've got other new plans up our sleeve.
Yes. So hi, everybody. I'm signing in. Oh, the son went and picked mushrooms. Oh, okay. Chanterelle pasta is what we served with our Halloween
delicious
candy. Oh, fun. Okay.
Give me a mushroom any day.
Yes. So Grove, and now we're going to get into the Scrappy thing.
We're going to dive into Scrappy. There's, and it's Scrappy with constraints.
I don't think of it as constraints.
That's a bad word.
A strategy.
A strategy.
Yeah. Okay. So there are 4 words. I got my little tiny chalkboard here. There are 4 words we're going to discuss today.
We use all the time.
Yeah. Hue, value, saturation, scale. And the reason that we need to keep this, and I'm going to pull this out, is that when you are trying to pull together a cohesive look from 100 fabrics or 60 fabrics or whatever.
I don't think anyone has more than 100 fabrics in their stash. Sorry.
You can't have it all.
No.
You can't have, if you want it to look cohesive, so you can't have all of those things in all ranges. Right. So let's just go through them really quickly. Will you pass that? You want to do a quick hue discussion?
Yeah, and I know we've done this many times, but it's always worth 2 minutes.
Yes.
So when we're talking about hue, that's often referred to as color. Think of that as spokes on the color wheel, whether it's blue, red, orange, green, violet. That's hue. Value goes from lightest in the middle to darkest at the extreme. So light to dark is value. And then the most confusing one is saturation, which is the intensity or purity of each color. So quilters usually use the term bright, like bright yellow, bright blue, bright red, and desaturated means it's been
Dusty.
it's dusty or dark, or there's something that's no longer in its purest state. Either it's been adulterated with another color or a white or a black.
So, and then scale is the size of the print. So these are really good examples here. So these are really similar in hue and value and saturation. However, the scale is really different, and that makes a difference in the way that your eye perceives it.
It makes a big difference. And this one this is lighter in value overall just because it has the lights,
right.
but that kind of ochre color is similar in
But
value.
even if you put it, so let's take this one out. Let's say you wanted to put this one in here. This would probably work better, but if you used this one in here, it would jump a lot. And you might want it to jump, but it's a different role.
Yes. So scale is, I think of scale two ways. It's how large is the motif, and also how much contrast is there. For instance, this motif is very large, but there's also contrast in value. It's a light motif on a medium dark background. Now, if the motif weren't so light, if it were brown, the scale is still large, but it might not have the same power in the palette.
Contrast.
It's the contrast within the scale that really sets it apart.
And we had a question from somebody, Susan, about working with mixing different sizes of print. So we'll discuss that today, into how you do that with a Scrappy palette. And but the first thing I want to kind of like step by step, okay, let's, because everything is Sound of Music related to me. Let's start at the very beginning. Because it's a very good place to start. And so the first thing you're going to do when you are approaching, when you think, I want to make something scrappy, is you're going to give yourself, start with an idea of how many fabrics is your definition of scrappy.
And how many do you think you need for the particular quilt you're making?
Yeah, are you making it just from your stash? Or are you starting with your stash and you're going to then add additional ones? Because how broad the stash or the palette is will have an effect on how wide you can go with hue, value, saturation, or scale. You might be able to go with a wide number of hues, but similar saturation, similar scales. You might decide to go with similar values, but
limit the hues.
Yeah, limit the saturation or the scale. Or
what we'll do is we'll walk you through kind of case studies here. So rather than just be words, you'll see how the fabrics work together.
But if you can
have these concepts in your head as we talk.
Yeah, or even just put them on a little scrap of paper next to you.
That's good.
Next to your grocery list or whatever. Okay, so the other thing is you're going to want to it's a kind of push me, pull you exercise between the pattern and the palette. And you go back and forth. But the first thing you should do is start by looking at the rolls of the fabric in that particular pattern.
So where are we starting?
So let's start, actually I was going to start with Do-Si-Do.
Oh, Do-Si-Do. That's a nice straightforward one.
Because you can see this when it's
very
folded,
clearly.
But so Do-Si-Do is
even more.
This was made with our Zest line, and as you can see, there's like this A B pattern in each row, but there's contrast in. They're all similar saturations. They're all pretty bright. there's none of this in here, right?
Nothing dusty
Yeah,
or
nothing,
muted.
right. So we designed it to do this, to be similar in saturation. But because, let's go back here, because we have limited the saturation and everything's pretty bright, we can have a wide range of value in hue and scale. So there's
Let's
some,
go ahead.
so there are some semi-large, I guess medium-sized prints, and then there are some smaller scale prints. But you can see that there's no background fabric needed here. There's no sashing, there's no border.
This is totally perfect for Scrappy.
But you would want to organize them into hues or values so you can get this contrast. And these pieces are also big enough in relation to the scale of the fabric that it's not so odd. Whereas you get a fabric like this, and you can see that this would not cut up super great into this size piece because this repeat is so big.
You don't see, each piece of it would look so different from the other.
You wouldn't be able to see what it is.
Right. And
So this is where the scale of the fabric needs to have some kind of relationship to the scale of the piece.
But also to talk about the range of value here, because we're sticking with similar saturation. Look, we've got a nearly white fabric in there, and just below it is a very dark kind of midnight blue. So we're going from light to dark in this. And Weeks was talking earlier about strategies. So the strategy here was kind of to, obviously we made this with our line of fabric, but this is a great stash buster too, because you could just create a palette that is cohesive. In this case, we made it cohesive by limiting the saturation. And then within that palette, you just pick pairs that are dissimilar enough that in the A-B pattern, the row is clear.
Yeah.
These two are different from these two and these two. And honestly, you can, if the palette is cohesive and you split it into pairs, you can just sew rows of this do-si-do, not even knowing what row goes next to which until you assemble it all.
And Sarah Beth, we're going to get to your question about using solids in Scrappy Quilts because that's a great question, and that's we've got that. We're going to get to that.
Yes.
So we're going to go back to analyzing the pattern and figuring out what the roles are that you need to fill with your Scrappy palette.
Yes.
So another option would be something like our chorus line quilt. So this had, was it 60, 70 fabrics in it? But you can see that they're all very narrow. So we were using itty bitty scraps in this.
These strips are cut 1 inch, so finished they're only ½ an inch wide.
But this is the palette that we pulled for that particular quilt. And you can see that they're all relatively small scale, and the ones that are larger scale are low contrast. So it works really well, at a 1 inch scale, which is not, this would not work in that because it's high contrast, it's large scale, and it's multicolored. So this has this really has to be used at a large scale.
Yeah, or is best at that, yes.
So the roles for chorus line are a solid background and then small scale multicolored prints, but you could use 30 in this quilt, or you could use 120. This has a lot of flexibility because what you're seeing is just little bands of color. It's not drawing a lot of attention to it. But you don't want to use anything in these strips that's close in value to the background fabric.
Exactly. And so again, the roll is so important. It has to be different from the background. And once again, that's one reason we used a solid for the background, because it would inherently be different from everything that was a print. You still have to be careful though to have value difference so that each of those strips is very visible.
And this kind of gets to Sarah Beth's question about solids, which are that you can use solids in Scrappy Quilts, but you can't use them in the same roll.
Okay, the chorus line is right there. I'll hold it up.
You can't use them in the same roll. But rank and file I wanted to show.
Oh, okay. I'll have to get that.
I think it's here.
Okay.
Isn't it in 12?
No.
What's it?
It's in 14.
Oh, 14.
I'll get that.
I'm here.
So here is the chorus line in person. And when you were asking about the roll of solids, you would not, the background is a solid. All of these little strips are prints. You would not want to make one of those strips a solid. Like, even if it were the same value, if it were like a light orange or something, it would be dissimilar enough that it would stand out. So,
because that's an extreme difference. It's kind of scale.
Yeah, scale's like a 0.
Yeah.
Now you could make this entirely with solids. That would be fantastic.
That would be fantastic.
I mean, that would be kind of a scrappy solid quilt. That would work. I mean, now I want to see it. So if anyone makes it, save me the time, make it. I'd love to see it.
Oh, I'm glad Cindy says chorus line is the absolute best. There's some tech billionaire who has one of these in Silicon Valley who commissioned one of these
for the lobby of their. Yeah, it was the entry of when they were a startup.
His window. Oh, no, well, who knows where it is now? But
so, and we've made this in bright red orange. We've done it in this kind of deep teal. It's just a.
And this is also, this is where I need to kind of make a case, because there is a lot of hubbub that people feel when they go into shops or they see on social media super large scale, super bright prints, but those are really hard to use with anything other than that pattern, or they're just not as versatile. And these are like those friends you have that are up for anything. And so these fabrics don't always get all the attention they deserve.
And yet
we design a lot of them and feel sometimes that they're overlooked. And can you show up the 3 cheers that on the cover?
Oh, the cover here. This is from Rediscovering Your Stash.
And these fabrics are similar in that they kind of read as one hue because they're small scale, but they are. You couldn't make that pattern very successfully with a large scale print.
No. So when you have this stack right here, which are the fabrics in the quilt, it's not that they're forgettable. They're beautiful colors. They're just subdued in terms of the prints and the motifs. And yet they're workhorses.
Yeah. And
make for beautiful quilts when they're put together.
So when we get back to, I'm so glad this is so helpful. Yes, these aren't rules. These are suggestions. Well, because, you might have something that really works, but I know that when we both teach and somebody has a quilt that they're unhappy with, it's scrappy, it's usually because there are solids in the same rolls as prints, or there's not enough contrast, or it's everything.
In most cases, we look at them and we say, there are 2 quilts happening here.
Yeah.
And it's often a matter of separating the scrappy palette into 2. And I think something that happens to a lot of quilters is you fall in love with a fabric, so you want to include it, and the scrappy quilt seems to be a good excuse to do that, but it doesn't fit in the roll that the others have.
But I think a lot of people have also taken the advice of just put it all in a bag and pull it out randomly, and if that works for you and you're happy with it, great. But I always say it depends on who's putting it in the bag in the first place.
Yeah, you make anyway.
So, but back to Sarah Beth's question of solids. This is the ultimate, rank and file is the ultimate scrappy solids quilt. And this was 120 or something.
I actually have to read.
Solids, yeah.
It was 150.
150 solids.
And we have solids from every manufacturer you've ever heard of. And we needed them all to pull this off.
And we sorted them into piles, and we show you in the layout.
Can you see? And I've got to try to
how
do
we
this without the glare.
organized it, how we sorted it to be able to do the color work.
So that gradation, what we did is each row went from light to dark, and it was extremely tricky because there are so many hues in this, and trying to go from light to dark while including all these hues is hard. It's much easier to do your light blues, your medium dark blues, and make a monochromatic gradation.
But you know what? You don't even have to do this quilt with an ombre.
No,
you could just do this quilt with a more narrow value range.
Yeah.
It doesn't even have to do the fade. It would be a beautiful quilt, you know, just with bands. You could do, well, you could show the color variations of what we did there. So you can organize your colors, and this particular pattern is extremely versatile for the way you can totally change the way it looks. But at any rate, but it starts with that pattern, because you've got to know, it's like, you know, the pattern is kind of your roadmap for putting together the palette, right?
I think with Scrappy Quilts, it's probably easiest to start with a pattern rather than the palette.
Like I said, it's a push you thing.
Yeah, and I admit that it's a little different from us, because as quilt designers, sometimes we do start with a palette and actually design a new quilt to work with that, and that's not.
Well, sometimes, but often we start. We have to go simultaneously, because when we present a line to, you know, whatever manufacturer, Benartex, right, you know, is who we're working with right now, but in the past it's been the same at other companies. We have to show them the sample quilt at the same time we show them. So we have to design, and we also have to make sure, because we've done it before where we, you know, 20 years ago when we were getting started, we didn't design fabrics for all the rolls we needed. And then we're like, you know, we need one more, you know. Yeah. So we kind of design, we go back and forth between the pattern and the palette.
So let's find another Scrappy quilt.
But hold on. So the rolls that we want to look for are dark versus light. So that would be, hold on.
Well, it could be the straightaway down there at the end.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I should have pulled out framed, but this is...
It's a little harder to see, but it's all over our social media. Straightaway is a good example of, we needed to have good contrast for all these stripes. So we designed a black and white to go with the brights.
But this, again, in terms of stash, whether you're working with our fabrics or your stash, it's every other fabric is light. So you get a regular stripiness that you could make this with all darks, but you would lose the banding effect. Or you wouldn't lose it, it would become more subtle. I mean, it could be a very beautiful quilt still. We were just after the graphic nature of this, so this roll thing comes down to, how many piles are you making on your cutting table? This is a sorting exercise that you're going to do. It is very, like, if you're a sorter, I'm a sorter.
Yeah, I think our whole family,
we're sorters.
We're sorters. We're not hoarders, but we're sorters. Like, so this is two. You need two. When you're talking about how do you make this cohesive, you have two rolls, two piles that you're sorting your fabric into for this pattern. And
you could have, in this case, we use the same black and white print for the every other stripe, and then the others were a multitude of prints. Exactly. But you could also make this by having two piles, one which are just all lights.
Yeah.
They could be light pastels for that matter.
But it could also be 27 black and white prints.
Or, because this is 2 rolls, you could make this as a 2 fabric quilt.
Yes, exactly.
You could simply have a black solid and a white solid, and it would work. So it
would look like a barcode, though.
Actually,
it would be very cool.
But this definitely, by understanding the rolls, it helps you make those 2 piles and sort.
Exactly. So we had, like, with the chorus line, there was a solid roll and then the small scale prints. And then with, let's look at this very popular quilt, Bold Proposition. And this is on Modern Quilts Illustrated 12 on the cover. This is a perfect example with what you're going to do with those larger scale scraps, in which, even though these fabrics are different, the reality is the way that the Cave Collective designs is they use the same colors over and over again. So these blend into each other a lot.
Even though they're radically different prints.
Yeah. So to organize them visually, you need a different roll. You need some solid that's going to give it some contrast, or some other print that's... Yeah. Okay, so we're going back to...
Got this, she's got the board.
Because they're all similar in hue, and they're similar in value, and they're similar in saturation, and they're similar in scale, all these fabrics. You've got to have some kind of contrast. Something that's not that hue, or not that value, or not that saturation, or not that scale.
And in this case, it's a dark, kind of espresso brown solid.
Right. So is this making sense? I know we get excited and we start to talk kind of fast, but please weigh in on the chat whether this is clear, unclear. You want us to repeat some things, let us know. But when you can use your scraps as long as you are not trying to go all over the color wheel, all over the values.
Can I ask you a favor?
Yeah.
Can you, because this is very clear to see this in these kind of hot pinks
Clear and
the brown.
Oh, good.
Can you just pick like 6 fabrics out of there, out of here maybe, to show how the same thing could work in a different set of fabrics?
Okay. And then I think so clear. Yay. What book is the pattern in? Okay, so that is Modern Quilts Illustrated number 12. And also, I'll put in a plug, because Bill did the most helpful thing for our website. If you haven't discovered our pattern finder, that is the best thing ever. If you go to the pattern finder, you can see thumbnail pictures.
I think I put about 120 different...
of all of the quilts to know where they are, to where you can find them.
It doesn't include books or quilts that are in like the 6 books we've written, but it's everything in our publications, everything that's on our website. So
yes,
it's a great way to
She's working on a cave quilt, and this really hits home.
And
this is the thing that's so hard, because those prints are so beautiful and they're so iconic, but if you don't have enough contrast with them, it just becomes mushy, like visually mushy, because you can't see the patchwork. You're going to all the trouble to cut up all this fabric, and then you can't see it.
But there are cases where people might like that. Like you could cut all of those fabrics into 5-inch squares, sew them all together, and it will just be a riot of color, and it will be beautiful. It just is different.
And the thing is, when we talk about developing these palettes and putting these fabrics together and editing, a lot of this you all know, because I've seen it in classes and workshops, but I think it's really helpful for people to be able to say out loud with words why this isn't working, because the times that you do get lost or you do get confused, if you have that framework of this, then you can say, is it one of these that's causing the difficulty? Okay, so we got a little tiny, hold on, so I just want to get lost in my own. Okay, so when we're looking at the rolls, we're looking for dark versus light, saturated versus neutral. Then the size of the pieces versus the size of the patterns. Can you please just move it around? I know it's distracting. So we're gonna sort the scraps into rolls, into groups based on the rolls available. And we're gonna look at the scale of the fabric in the context of the other pieces. So this goes to Susan's question about how do you choose prints of different scales? And if we go back, let me go to Fabric Fusion, our old, this is just the best teaching example ever. So if you're using 15 fabrics, then you need to keep that range of scale pretty similar. You can't do this. Here, I'll give you another example. Oh, here we go. You can't use a big scale like this with 14 other small scale prints. So what you want to do is, if you want to incorporate a wide variety of scales, you want to have the scales similar. So if you want to use this fabric and you want to use this fabric with it, those are different. They're different in scale, but they're similar in value.
And saturation.
And saturation. Then you start adding others that have similar scales.
And people often talk about bridging colors in quilting.
Yeah.
That to get from the red to the blue, maybe you include a purple. We also often talk about bridging scale as well. And I think people don't look at that. And if you look at the Fabric Fusion quilt, this has so many, I mean, this is, you can put so many fabrics in this. And if you look at the range of scales, they're from tiny kind of ditzy little Civil War prints.
Or yarn dyes.
Medium scale batiks, and then there's some really large scale prints as well. But we've made sure that there's a range. It's not just one large scale or just one small scale, but
it's kind of like if you were,
a lot of all.
If you were to think about the scale ranging from, like, is it a 1-inch repeat or a 2-inch repeat or a 12-inch repeat? It's, you want to have similar sizes. The smaller the number of fabrics, the more similar the scale needs to be.
In a scrappy quilt, generally,
right.
Yes.
Right.
So
whereas if you have 120, or I think this is 65 or something, you really have a wide range.
Yeah, and this can be whatever you want it to be. But definitely, I think what Weeks just said is key. Scrappy can be 12 different, it can be 200 different. And the more you have, the more you can bridge the different scales and the different hues. But for cohesion...
And this is where I think it's really important to say, especially with this quilt, for those of you who haven't heard our discussion about this quilt before, we made this was a very contrarian quilt. This was an American Patchwork and Quilting like 15 years ago or something like that. And part of the reason we wanted to make it and chose the palette we did is that we wanted to show people that their psychological rules in their head about genres of fabric was not, it was too limiting. It was too limiting. Yeah. And so there are batiks in here, and there are K-Fab and Amy Butler fabrics in here, and there are traditional, Civil War reproduction prints.
Thimbleberries, Civil War.
There's our fabrics in there. There's Marshall Jersey fabrics in there. So, but what gets it, can you go back to this? So we have a wide range of hues. We have similar value. Can you pull it back up?
Okay.
Similar values, right?
A limited values. We didn't do anything totally white, and we didn't do anything totally black. We kind of think of it as,
Mid-range.
limiting to a mid-range of values.
But we really limited the saturation. There are no brights in here. There's nothing like this in here, right? So then we could have a variety of scales.
This is the brightest saturation. And we wanted to include that because without it, the whole quilt could get kind of flat and sleepy. But this, can you hold that one back up, please?
Yeah.
Is not that. So we kept out the most saturated, we kept out the darkest, and we kept out the lightest, which allowed us to have if you actually look at a color wheel, there are purples, reds, blues, greens, browns, yellows, oranges.
But we could get away with it.
Because everything else is limited.
Right. So this is the other version of that. Hold on, and then we're going to get to pulling some fabrics. But I think would you get stash out so they can see? This is United States of Green. And this is an example where, because we limited the hue, we could go crazy with the, it was folded. We could go crazy with the hue. We limited the hue, so we could go crazy with the value and the saturation and the scale even, because there were some larger scale batiks in there, but they're low contrast because it's a single hue.
So from a distance, they read as tone on tone, even though they're a larger scale print.
Yeah.
And this has a surprising range of saturation. There are some kind of grayed out greens.
Look at this, like right here, there's a very kind of bright citron next to a kind of grayer
olivey.
Yeah, exactly. And even these kind of muddy batiks.
And nearly black greens to very, very pale ones. So again, limiting that hue allowed us to be super scrappy. This has hundreds of different fabrics, but they have clear roles in the quilt.
And this isn't even just green, it's a yellow green. It's not overall, like a blue, it's like such a narrow, big range of values.
If you put a strip of blue-green in here, it would pop.
Yeah.
It would look terrible.
So, okay.
So
let me see.
Okay.
So a couple of, just before we go on, a couple of things to think about is that prints, batiks, yarn dyes are all going to feel the same in a quilt. Solids are going to feel different. They need a different role in the quilt.
Yeah, if you're mixing them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's not that you can't include them. We showed you in the bold proposition that if they, or in chorus line, if they have a clear role to provide a crisp edge, that's one thing, but you don't want to mix them in the same role as the others most of the time.
Right.
They do stand out.
So, and then the other thing that's just kind of like, that can play with you a little bit are novelty prints and any prints with words on them. And Mr. Graphic Design Professor will explain why that is.
Words, I love typography. Fabrics with words are wonderful often, but the problem is you always want to read them. So rather than being a blue fabric or a green fabric, it becomes the fabric that says London, Paris, Rome, or live, laugh, love.
Yeah.
And the role of that fabric totally changes from being a color or being a shape to being something that you read and something that has meaning.
And that has a directionality,
and
because it's a word.
So it's interesting. I see a lot of people who use kind of Japanese style prints that have the Japanese, Chinese characters on them. And most of the quilters using those can't read them. So they're just decorative shapes. But you put that in front of someone who reads that language and they immediately read it. And so it has a different, it's different altogether. So I'm not saying you can't use text on fabrics, but in a scrappy quilt, on any quilt, it's a caution. I always say it's the curse of literacy, that because we can read, we do read, and it changes your relationship, just like a novelty fabric.
Yeah.
Instead of being the primarily blue fabric, it's the blue fabric with bananas on it, or the blue fabric with cute cats on it. And most novelty fabrics are kind of stylized, simplified illustrations so that you see it and you see it's the Hershey bar, you see it's the fishing fly, or it's the, and so cognitively it becomes that. It's no longer just a color. So novelty prints and text are tricky. Often they work best when you focus on them alone.
Or you fussy cut them.
You use a ton of text so that there's so much to read that you don't read it individually. That can be cool. You know, a lot of you have probably seen people who do black and white quilts with tons of newsprint. Beautiful.
Especially if it's one of those collage newsprints. A newsprint that doesn't really have words on it.
Yeah.
And some people, it's kind of like the Chinese characters. If it's in Italian or whatever, you know, they're not reading it, but it still is directional. And so
we actually did, the only text fabric we ever did, Weeks hand wrote all of the text, and it was gibberish. There was nothing, it was in cursive. And they weren't even real characters. So you looked at it and it felt very friendly and familiar, but there was absolutely nothing.
There were no
discernible words.
Exactly. So it basically became a really subtle stripe. But so before we move on, I want to sort of, because we covered so much, I just want to ask, are there, before we start to pull some palettes to give you some samples, have we covered the kind of the basic structure that will be helpful to you as you're making your scrappy quilts? Because it sounds like what I'm seeing is people are mostly saying that this is helpful and they understand it, but are there any aspects of this that we need to expound upon before we go forward? If there are,
if not, we've got lots to say.
Yeah, we've got lots to still discuss. Okay, so while you're
so I'll prep.
Yes. So we've got this little the other way.
The other way.
Yeah, that way. So one of the things that we were looking at was how to use scraps that are bright or scraps that have white in them, because I think we've gotten on that before. But one of the things that I wanted to show you is, hold on, why don't we, let's just look at kind of our zest line. Can you lay those out and include these? Yeah. So in this line, and this is similar to, this would be similar to your scraps as well. What we did is divide the prints into things that have white and things that don't, because these would be the two piles that you would have if you're making something scrappy, because you can see that there's automatically going to be contrast once that white gets in there. So these would be two different rolls, and this is the do-si-do or straight away, either one of those. So if you were going to start, and you were going to start with the idea that I'm going to have brights, and then I'm going to have prints with white in them, or that are going to be able to achieve this because you've identified in your pattern that there are two rolls. And then from there, you build onto these two piles. And
you could, so this happens to be from one line, but we could just build on this from our stash, adding fabrics that are fairly saturated, that have no white in them. And we need an assistant. Yes. Actually, we need 4 hands each.
But so these are just these are larger scale prints, but we could add these in.
Oh, that totally works.
because depending on the pattern, on the scale, but we could start introducing some larger scale prints into this palette, because you see we've still got lots of contrast here.
And as we do this,
there's
we
similar
can also
saturation.
we can also
value.
kind of reevaluate. Like this top print has more discernible color, and we might say, you know,
come out.
at this point we might take that out just because it's starting to compete with some of the new additions.
Pull them a little higher so everybody can see.
There we go.
So do you see how that still looks cohesive? Because we've got similar hues, we've got similar values, we've got similar saturations, and
there's a variety of scale, which is fine. So
we can have the variety of scale because we've organized, we've sorted.
It's kind of like the motto today is like, you can't have it all, but you can have a lot by making a little set of, I hate the word rules, but
guidelines.
Guidelines.
Hold on, I'm going to add, but what?
We happen to be sitting in front of drawers of our stash, but we could start pulling.
But if you started to add this over here, can you see that this belongs over here? It should be, you know, you don't have to have tremendously stark contrast, but you need to have enough contrast that if you walk away from it 10 feet away, you're going to be able to see, based on the scale that you're going to cut it at, you know, if they're 1-inch strips, you better have some good, you know, contrast.
Yeah. And so this, you know, we keep talking about the sorting exercise, and that's what this is. This can get very scrappy very quickly in a beautiful way, and so can that. You just have 2 rolls. And
I will say one of the things that I think our fabrics do really well is if you're using them in conjunction with Kaif's fabrics, they give you a little bit more scale difference. So everything isn't all the same scale. Yeah. They really play well with Kaif's prints and Tula's prints and the prints that are out there that are really large scale.
But challenging.
Yeah, and that maybe you have scraps left over because you fussy cut the little raccoon in the, you know, trash can or whatever for that quilt, but then you've got a lot of scraps left over that you want to use at a smaller scale because the main, you know, the unicorn or the kitten or whatever are really large in scale, but there's a lot that happens between them. So it's good to have some slightly smaller scale but equally bright fabrics to work with them.
Absolutely. Okay.
I'm
going to slide these down.
So I'm going to go in a totally different palette. Do you want to talk about starting? Let's say we're going to start with, a lot of you tell me you have reproduction fabrics or Civil War fabrics that you want to be able to use in a more modern way, in a scrappy way, but not have them feel quite so flat or traditional, I guess is the way to put it. So you can start to see that we've already got this is such a different value that we're already starting to sort into 2 piles here, right? Let's just assume that this is a quilt that has 2 rolls. You know, I mean, there could be 3 rolls or 5 rolls or whatever, but we'll just start, make that assumption.
Doing a light and dark here?
Yeah.
And you'll find sometimes when you do this, that there are...
But can you see this is already coming together? This is already starting to...
Yeah. Oh, that goes here.
And then you can add these.
And every now and then you get something that you're like, I don't know which side it goes on. And you may...
Gotta go up.
Got to go up there.
Yeah.
Gosh, these are... Why haven't we made anything with these?
Because
we don't have enough time.
Yes, well, it's on the to-do list.
Yes.
Yes.
But what's important here also is to see the range that some of these are woven, some of them are prints, And that doesn't matter so much because they fit within these other constraints.
But can you pick up that do-si-do quilt again, please?
Yes.
But you could make the do-si-do
Oh my
quilt
gosh.
with a palette like this.
Okay,
And
so
it would look modern and fresh,
a lot of times people see a quilt like
but
this
cohesive.
in a magazine or a shop, and it's a very hard leap to go from this to this. But part of the beauty of this pattern, it's one rectangle. I mean, it's the simplest form imaginable, but can you see how this is the same A, B?
Yeah.
You could just pair these and make one of this and one of this, any of them paired from one column and the other. You make all your rows, you sew the rows together. And I mean, we have more of these. We have lots more of these fabrics.
But
Very quickly,
they were purchased with this idea in mind.
we had no idea what the quilt would be, but we
I'm
could
like,
tell.
I need 2 piles because I need to be able to have some kind of pattern.
And so that does.
And if I wanted to add like a linen white or like a soft gray or, you know, kind of like a honey color or caramel or something to it,
Yeah.
or even like aubergine or something, we could, but at least we've got this for sashing or something. But at least we've got 2 values so we can go crazy. So we've got lots of different hues, very clear values, very similar saturations. So we could go larger in scale and add in some like William Morris fabrics or something like that.
Let me see. Here we go.
That goes light.
Here's a green. There weren't any greens really in here before, and it doesn't scream green because it's desaturated.
And that
These
doesn't
are
scream
all
traditional fabric either.
These are all desaturated, which is what unifies them. So something unifies each pile, but the 2 piles are sorted and separated.
Exactly.
So, man, this is just a scrappy quilt in the making. Can I hand that back?
Is there some
Don't worry about
okay.
that.
All right. So can you scroll up to see whether there are any other questions?
Okay, sorry. Okay, we're good.
All right. And so one of the things to look at, as we said, is that you're not going to worry about genres. You're not going to worry about whether or not you can put a plaid in there. So hold on, for example, there's.
Okay.
Can you put up the light, the zest? This going with this.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. So you can see that yarn dyes work really beautifully with prints if it's this, and they're similar in scale and similar in saturation and similar.
And this also works because they have a similar range. They're kind of thin light stripes with medium. It's kind of lights and mediums in both of these.
But this doesn't work because this has a kind of desaturated,
a grayed out blue
and cream. Right. So this looks dirty next to the others. But it looks fantastic.
So, oh, look at that. This is really pretty.
But it looks fantastic with this green chambray.
So again, that's really a saturation issue. Those 2 are desaturated.
You start to see this as a different quilt.
And I think there's a preconceived notion that a lot of people have that modern has to be bright, and I think whenever you start naming styles, that also can limit you. Just make nice palettes. Don't worry about what it's called.
But I think they're using that term because they're trying to. I think it's often synonymous with a little bit more graphic, little less, sometimes a little less fussy.
Yeah.
And a little bit more clean. That just feels a little visually a little bit more minimalist.
Yeah.
Than sort of the Baltimore album.
And I think that's why that do-si-do quilt with those beautiful fabrics we just had up would be a nice, modern, yet comfortable, livable.
Absolutely. So one last thing to be thinking about is I want to show some fabrics that are kind of special considerations that that you want to kind of be aware of with your fabrics. Now, these are Jane Sassaman's fabrics, which are beautiful, and we're big Jane Sassaman fans. But they often have, I'm trying to look for an example here. They often have a lot of white in them.
And they're very large scale in general.
They're very saturated. So it becomes challenging to use them even with, so you can see, for example, if you open this up, even this is like a cave. It looks a little bit muddier. I mean, the cave is so bright, but her fabrics are even brighter, and because they have that white in there that draws so much attention to themselves, that they are often best used together.
And I'll say the question earlier about incorporating solids, almost all of her fabrics are illustrations where the bands of color are absolutely solid. There's no shadowing, there's no gradation. Mm-hmm. So it's very easy to use solids with these because they have the same flat graphic nature. And because she has big, bold stripes and big, bold forms, no one draws a curve more beautifully in fabric design than Jane does. But they are always going to make a Jane Sassaman quilt.
And she wants that. She refers to all of her patterns as Sassaman. You know, she's looking for one specific look.
And she's fantastic at it.
Yeah. But if you look, for example, at the scale issue, if you wanted to use, this is from our Sunnyside line, you know, the color actually looks great with her fabrics, but you would want to, if you were using these two in a quilt, you'd want to have some scale that is bigger than this and smaller than this
to mediate.
If they're going to be in the same rolls.
Yeah.
If you were looking for some kind of little sashing or center or something to make with hers,
but
you know, that would work.
In general, these would be hard to use in a scrappy quilt. I think
unless the pieces are really big.
Really big.
Yeah. So let's see. I like the idea that using nice palettes and not laboring the overall design. Exactly. Yeah. So I want to just make sure I've gotten, okay, so Patricia asked how you balance lights and darks and if there's a formula. The formula goes down to the rolls. It's about the rolls and then making sure that within each roll, it's clear, you know, where something is. Because back to those, what are those?
Well, I want to actually address that. There is not a mathematical formula. However,
there's
if you have a quilt,
contrast. Oh, I'll put this down.
If we have a quilt back to Fabric Fusion that has, this fabric is quite dark. The one below it is actually quite light. So if this was on a scale of 10 being black and 0 being white, this quilt goes kind of from 2 to 8, and the goal here is even distribution. It's not so much how many of each. If you have too few of anything, they stand out as being unexpected. But if you distribute the darks, if I pull back, do you see how they're distributed throughout the whole quilt? So it's not one-off. Same thing with the brights, like the bright.
And can I just interrupt for 1 second and just say that I don't think it is 2 to 8. I think it's 3 to 8 because there's a step between the sashing and the lightest fabric of the quilt.
That's true.
And that's really important because you can have a wide range within among the prints, but it's got to have enough contrast with the background.
So there always has to be that original step.
Yeah.
So no, we don't. I'm always wary if someone says you need 20% of this and 80% of that. If anyone ever gives me a mathematical formula, I back up and say, it's not about a formula. They're trying to say maybe the rule is you have a little more of something and a little less of something. But I would never take that literally, personally. I think
it's the same with the people who believe that every quilt needs a light, medium, and dark.
Right.
Because if there are 3 rolls, then maybe that would apply. But a lot of these quilts that we've shown, there are 2 rolls.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is kind of a different way of saying you need contrast.
Yes.
Among the rolls in the quilt.
So I hope, I
have one last question.
Oh, shit. Okay.
So I think we discussed the scale thing and the solids and Scrappy. But Marianne had this question of, what is your initial plan to unify the palette when starting a Scrappy quilt? So to circle back to that, the initial plan is to figure out what the rolls are, how many piles you need, and then make sure that each of those piles is cohesive.
Yeah. So if you have a quilt that's
the critical thing.
Scrappy and you know it's going to be reds, oranges, and yellows, you may make a pile of reds, oranges, and yellows, and when you stand 10 feet back, you might see that, wow, one of those reds is going towards violet and really stands out. Or one of those yellows is a little dirty and is going olive.
Yeah.
So I like the idea of sorting.
Yeah.
And having a little freedom within it, but sorting can help.
But within those piles, that should look cohesive based on hue, value, saturation, and scale. Yeah. Okay.
So that
was a whirlwind.
Yeah. Lots of Scrappy.
Lot. But you're welcome, Patricia, for answering the question about the
And
dark.
I hope you're all having a wonderful day. It was fun having people from here today all the way from places we love. Having someone in Florence and having someone in Delafield, Wisconsin, 2 places, we love them both. Spent lots of time in Delafield cycling.
Yes, we did. So we will have our last for 2022 Quilts First on December 1st. And I'd like to do a wrap up, a kind of ask us anything sort of. What do you think of that?
That sounds fun.
I think that would be fun. So leave us questions below as to what topics you would love us to include, and we will put together the questions that you ask us in social media, and I'll put a call out throughout the month, but then, also the kind of FAQ, that we get for
that sounds great. And
tips.
We will, as always, this will be on Facebook, but we'll also upload this within a day or so to YouTube for those of you who aren't on Facebook. Yes. And just, view it at your leisure. So thank you. So
let us know what's of interest to you. And we've got the Swedes and the French are in the house. Hello. So let us know what you'd like us to. We'll have a kind of end of year grab bag of questions for next time. Yeah. So happy sewing, and thanks for all of your enthusiasm and
enjoy the autumn.
Exactly.
Take care, everyone.